everyone joining us. We're just going to give a couple more minutes for folks to filter in. So bear with us. In about 2 minutes, we will start the program, but just hang out for a little bit. Hey there, for everyone joining us, we are just going to give it a couple more minutes for everyone to filter in, but you're in the right place. So just hang out for 1 more minute and we'll start the show. Okay, hi, welcome everyone joining us at home. This is Responding to the Crisis, Reviving Made in America, and I'm Miro Karenha. I'm the co-founder and publisher of Our Daily Planet, and I'm so glad you guys are here for this, I think the 5th in this series that Our Daily Planet has partnered with University of Michigan and Third Way to talk about many of the aspects of the COVID-19 recovery. And so today our focus obviously is on manufacturing, and this is a really important conversation to have because manufacturing currently employs 11.7 million workers and it accounts for over 11% of our total economic output. So this is a huge sector. It has immense opportunities to employ Americans. It also has immense opportunities to decarbonize, to help us meet our climate goals. And that's a little bit of the conversation that we are going to have here today. And so quickly, I wanted to introduce our wonderful panelists who've taken the time to be with us today. Firstly, we have Third Way Climate and Energy Director Ryan Fitzpatrick, joined by Associate Vice President of Innovation and Economic Development at George Mason University, Paula Sorrell. And we have the former Advanced Manufacturing Office Director at the Department of Energy, Mark Johnson, and also currently with Clemson University. So we're so thrilled that we have this amazing team of panelists here today to walk us through this conversation. And I just wanted to say that at the end of our panel discussion, we'll have about 15 minutes for Q&A. So audience, please start thinking of your questions throughout this. And at the end of the panel discussion, I will cue you when it's time to submit a question. And you can do that by scrolling. If you put your cursor over your screen on the bottom ribbon, there's a place for a chat or actually for Q&A. And so you can submit your questions there. We will see them. We will get to as many as we can. But without further ado, we will jump into our panel discussion. So my first question, I'm going to ask Ryan. The hope for many in the collective green community is that the post-COVID stimulus spending can help put our nation on track to becoming a clean energy leader. What opportunities exist to expand the U.S. manufacturing sector to help supply the materials needed for this transition? What can we do better, and what are we doing well already? I just wanted to ask you this to kind of frame our conversation. Oh, I think you're on mute, Ryan.
I knew this would happen.
No worries.
Thanks, Muriel. So I'd first say clean energy, for those who don't know, it's been one of the fastest growing industries worldwide over the past decade, and there's still enormous room for additional growth um, once the economy recovers and global economy recovers. The global market for clean energy technologies has been approaching $1 trillion, which is massive. And obviously, any country would want their domestic industries to capture as much of that as they can. There are a few things that make manufacturing particularly important for a national economy. It requires a range of education and skill levels. And in the US, that means opportunity for upward mobility, for good paying jobs. The average compensation in manufacturing in the US in 2018 was around $85,000. And that's, 25% or so higher than the economy-wide average. And here's a kicker. It's not just the jobs in manufacturing. Every manufacturing job supports between 3 and 4 additional jobs in other sectors. It's the highest job multiplier rate in the economy. So it's even higher for tech-intensive manufacturing jobs. So you really want, to maximize your manufacturing in order to maximize the other sectors of your economy. The US has a ton going for it in terms of securing a greater share of the promising clean energy markets globally. We, as you mentioned, manufacturing had an output of $2.3 trillion in 2018. That's 11% of GDP. We've got a highly skilled workforce. And there's been devastation, nearly 1 million jobs lost in manufacturing since the beginning of the year. And that is devastating for the workers, for their local economies. But it also shows that the workforce is there and ready and capable if we put it to use in producing low carbon goods. And I'd also say we've got world-class training programs and apprenticeship programs run by unions and other entities that can rapidly build and adapt skills among the workforce so we can evolve as markets evolve. I mentioned our university and lab innovation system. So the ecosystem that's in many cases federally supported supports a ton of RD&D. Mark and Paul have been on the front lines, front and center in a lot of these innovation partnerships. So glad that they'll be able to provide some insight here too. But we could be taking greater advantage of that innovation ecosystem by making additional federal investments. Congress has been increasing investments and appropriations for clean energy RD&D over the past 3 years, which is fantastic. That's the good news. As a share of GDP, though, we continue to lag behind a lot of our competitors. I think we're at 14th or 15th place, according to the American Energy Innovation Council. So we need to continue increasing those investments. The last thing I'd say, one of the most important areas in need of improvement, if we want to be the ones supplying more of these products to the world, is driving the market for them domestically. So take electric vehicles or EV battery manufacturing as examples. There are a number of reasons why China is outpacing US manufacturers in these product categories. It's not just about cheaper labor, because European manufacturers are outpacing us too. Both China and the EU are creating market incentives and requirements that are driving sales of these products. So they've got carrots and sticks. And these companies, they want to be build near where they sell and to export to surrounding areas. If the US wants to encourage investment in domestic manufacturing of many of these products, we really need to encourage a domestic market. Over the past 3.5 years, we've seen more efforts to weaken federal standards that create domestic demand for products like EVs instead of strengthening them. We've seen clean product incentives for consumers and developers, things like rebates and tax incentives, investment tax credits, blocked or allowed to expire. So there is a lot of room for us to do better to instill confidence that the US is the place to invest in manufacturing clean energy products.
Thanks for that, Ryan. And Mark, I wanted to pivot to you to build off Ryan's point about the fact that our federal investment in manufacturing has been really mixed. So if our leaders were to take a vested interest in growing the manufacturing sector, how can we ensure that it's modern and competitive? What innovations in IT, et cetera, can help us make sure that we are rebuilding the sector and building it up in a very smart way?
Yeah. That's a great question. I'm gonna start by reinforcing something Ryan just said, because as we wind up going through this time of COVID, there's been a sort of a renewed understanding in America that manufacturing does matter. That's not news to people in the manufacturing sector. It's not news to people even in the information technology sector that their jobs are dependent on there being a manufacturing sector nearby, right? So this is not news to people that are actually in it, but I think there's a broader recognition that manufacturing does matter, whether it's making respirators and ventilators or making the vehicles we have, or as we wind up making new clean energy products. The number Ryan had, though, was a little over $2 trillion in the manufacturing sector. So for people that wind up thinking, oh, the United States doesn't manufacture anything anymore, there are only about 10 countries in the world where their entire economy is $2 trillion. Our manufacturing sector alone is that big. We are the second largest manufacturing sector on an absolute basis in the world. And so the United States is a great place to invest in manufacturing. It has been for years, and it will continue to be for that. So why is that? The other part is what you pointed to in terms of innovation and technology. The US is the best place in the world, bar none, to get wide-scale innovation into the economy. There are a number of places where people can wind up directing specific areas through incentives and technology, essentially buying a market out of it. And that, can be a competitive advantage in a short term for some areas. But what the United States' real strength are places where you have universities coming together with national labs, coming together with entrepreneurs, coming together with manufacturers, and solving on a daily basis these technology innovation questions. And so reinforcing that incentive in the United States, that sort of natural characteristic in the United States, is probably a great way to wind up going. One of the areas that's been investing, and you look at manufacturing employment as well, the peak year for manufacturing employment had 19 million jobs in it. We had, before COVID, about 12.5 million jobs in manufacturing. The decline went down to the minimum point about 2010 at about 11.5 million jobs. The peak year was 1978. I would say the majority of people on this call were not alive in 1978. This is not something that happened new. This is as a result of transitions to a more productive economy. Is a huge part about that. You have a huge number of jobs that are outside the manufacturing sector that would not exist if you did not have those jobs in the manufacturing sector. So this becomes a foundation of what we wind up doing. How do we wind up utilizing things like smart manufacturing technologies, which is just massive widespread information technology connected to the operational technology of manufacturing, is a huge area for innovation. By the way, this is an area where workers, companies, governments, everybody wind up winning. You wind up using your resources more effectively, so you wind up getting a cleaner, more productive output, whatever sector you're selling into. You wind up making every person who's doing manufacturing more productive. As a result, that winds up raising the standard of living for everybody. It makes the companies more competitive so they can wind up gathering more market share. And it makes the United States really the highlight of this. And I think one of the things I like to point out is, so about 20 miles from me here in South Carolina, BMW has their largest plant in the world. That is the largest exporting automotive plant in the United States. 70% of those cars are sold overseas. That is not Germany investing in South Carolina to sell cars to the US. That's Germany investing in the United States because they know this is the best place to wind up manufacturing cars competitively. 20% of those cars are ultimately sold in China. So think about that. That says the United States' competition on a global basis is not South Carolina against California against Michigan. It is, we wind up competing against the world. And what our home court advantage on this is innovation. How do we connect those breakthroughs that we have in our research laboratories as quickly and effectively as possible into the manufacturing floor? How do you connect those new technologies to the training curriculum that your technical and community colleges deliver, so our workforce then is best equipped to wind up taking advantage of that? And those are all the kinds of innovations that really wind up driving, with public sector investment, opportunity for economic growth.
Thank you, Mark. That was a really good snapshot. And Paula, I wanted to turn to you to kind of frame manufacturing in the current context of the COVID-19 crisis. And we've seen that throughout this crisis, factories have temporarily closed down, and tension has arisen between CEOs and governments as the nation has grappled with social distancing and public safety guidelines. So going forward, how can the government best engage with the private sector to ensure that manufacturing in this current era of pandemics, keeps workers safe while also staying competitive?
That's a great question. I was teaching a class at the University of Michigan in late January, early February, when we started, we were using small and medium-sized manufacturing companies as case studies. And what we saw happening were signs of distress in their supply chain due to COVID. So even our small and medium-sized manufacturers couldn't get the materials and the products that they needed. This was before anyone knew how bad it would get and how the supply chain would be so completely, deeply affected. Those small companies at that time were dealing with questions like, do I develop my own supply chain? Do I make investments in this area when I don't know what the future looks like? I mean, just the financial instability drives a lot of decisions. Manufacturers in general, and we really saw this in the Midwest, took action quickly and most often at their own expense to transition to provide medical equipment. For companies producing PPE, it isn't financially sustainable. The margins are much smaller by comparison. So what can the government do? To your question, ensure availability of locally sourced PPE and the materials to create them, provide adequate testing. Countries have done it. We're a little behind the curve there. And one example is, that we ran out of swabs. Swabs seem like a very simple product to be able to manufacture. As it turns out, there are lots of challenges with producing swabs. One of them is getting the raw materials. The other is having the equipment to put them together. It's some things that seem simple and to transition are more complicated than you'd think.
Thanks, Paula. And Ryan, we've gotten a good overview so far of just the breadth of the manufacturing sector. So, the natural first step to reducing the carbon intensity of the sector is generally efficiency. But can you talk a bit more about where we go after efficiency? Because efficiency can only get us so far. So what comes next?
Yeah, that's a really good question. And you're right. I mean, efficiency is very important. It's almost 2/3 of the primary energy that is consumed by U.S. manufacturers that gets lost during power or steam generation, transmission, process heating, lighting, HVAC, all these types of uses. So that shows a huge opportunity to improve efficiency and minimize that waste. You're never going to get that down to zero. That's not going to be an effective way to operate. But we have a lot of room to grow there. And I think that, that's an astounding statistic, even after I've been hearing it for quite some time. But, U.S. manufacturers in sectors like steel and cement, they've actually made really huge strides in efficiency over the past 2 decades, reducing their energy waste. And we have some of the most efficient facilities in the world. But manufacturing processes are always going to require energy. So as you said, efficiency isn't enough on its own. You need to do several other things. Electrify what you can. And as the power sector continues to decarbonize, it's very promising and its downward trajectory needs more assistance and policy support. But power is getting cleaner. That said, a lot of the manufacturing processes that we're talking about here, they need a lot of heat, not just electricity. So when we're talking about temperatures as high as 2,000 degrees or higher, in some cases, and quantities that are required in some of these large facilities, electricity is not the most effective way, or in some cases isn't a possible way to provide that. So electrification is important. That's not enough on its own either. You can also change your inputs. So using lower carbon fuels and feedstocks. That could include hydrogen, as long as it's not produced with unmitigated fossil fuels, but that's something that shows up in a lot of decarbonization scenarios, increased use of hydrogen at industrial facilities. You can also swap out materials. So a fun example is in cement, and that's roughly 6 to 8% of global emissions. You can actually replace some of the cement in concrete with a material called fly ash. It's also known as coal ash, or it's the byproduct when you're combusting coal. We have way too much of it in storage ponds and facilities. But for every ton of cement that you replace with fly ash, you reduce your emissions by 1 ton, which is pretty huge. So, finally, I'd say carbon capture is going to be an incredibly important piece of solving this puzzle and getting to a lower carbon industrial economy, especially in heavy industries where there aren't a lot of alternatives that are available to fully decarbonize. Hitting our climate targets is going to absolutely require more deployment of CCUS in industrial facilities. We'll stick with the cement example. You're always going to create greenhouse gases using processes anything like what we use today, just from chemical reactions that happen. It doesn't matter where you get your energy from. You have to figure out a way to manage and avoid emitting those particles. So CO2 can be and is being captured at a variety of industrial facilities and then stored or used for beneficial products. My colleague Matt Bright recently put out a map of CCUS projects around the world, and the US is actually home to several industrial projects that are underway, including some new ones on a cement facility and one on a fertilizer plant. So it's technically possible, but we're going to need to support it with additional federal policy because it's going to be an extremely vital piece of solving the puzzle.
That's great. And Mark, I'd be remiss if I didn't come to you for a follow-up question on the efficiency portion of this, because that's so much in your wheelhouse. I wanted to ask if you had anything to add to Ryan's remarks here.
Yeah, I think it's a really hard problem, first of all, to address, because we have 3 goals we're trying to accomplish simultaneously that I think everyone on this call would say is a worthy goal. One is the manufacturing sector provides all the stuff that all of us use every day. Right. And I feel lucky enough in my standard of living that I'm able to perhaps pay a little bit more, but it's usually the least of us that would wind up paying more on it as a percentage of their costs. So adding cost to it is to wind up achieving our environmental goals is not necessarily a good way forward. Right. At the same time, we want to have environmental sustainability. How do we wind up accomplishing that? So there's a solution to all of these. How do you do it cost effectively? And then the third part is you look at where energy is used, and Ryan hit the nail on the head that actually half of all energy winds up being used in the manufacturing sector in 2 sectors alone, making chemicals and refining petroleum, right? And when I say making chemicals, I'm saying all of the things that are around us have ethylene in them. We have ammonia out there. We have all the stuff that provides the product we have every day. How do we wind up doing that? So you need to wind up innovating as a pathway forward on it. You have, as well as I would say, chemical and petroleum. Then you wind up having the steel and particularly iron making for steel manufacturing and concrete. These are called energy intensive industries. These tend to be very, very large facilities with long-term investment and fixed capital. This is why the whole idea of using the information technology innovation is so important for us as a nation, right? Because we can wind up utilizing it. Can you take the existing infrastructure you have and wind up figuring out how do I use that more effectively so I can get the products I need without emitting as much and using as much energy and emitting as much carbon on it? You can do things like unleash the power of the high performance computing assets we have at our universities and national labs. Some of the most powerful computers on the planet are actually assets owned by the US federal government. We wind up using those for a lot of national security issues and sort of fundamental basic science, astrophysics kind of applications. Why can't we use that to figure out how do we make the everyday products we have more energy efficient? And so those are areas where the Department of Energy has actually been investing. And then on a third level, how do you wind up getting to those small manufacturers out there? Because as they wind up using energy, that's the difference between life and death for them. They're focused on making payroll every week, right? And I think Paula can wind up commenting on this even more than I can. But every dollar they wind up saving is really, really important out there.
Yeah, and to your point, Mark, and I'm going to pivot to Paula now. So I wanted to ask you, how can small and medium-sized manufacturers specifically be supported to reduce their environmental footprints? What challenges do these entities face that large manufacturers do not?
So I love working with small and medium-sized manufacturers because of their agility and the high impact you can get with a little bit of input. When I was at University of Michigan, we're working with small and medium-sized companies and helping them transition to other markets and new technologies. For anywhere between $30,000 and $90,000, you could get a significant economic output, exponential, in fact. So the economic development play of working with a company that might be the sole employer in its economy is really critical to us. The companies of this size are focused on making payroll and getting product out the door. So when it comes to bringing new technologies or new processes, often the expertise and the investment has to come from the outside. Three thoughts in that are, there are many successful federal government programs that support small manufacturers once they're distressed, but they have to be really distressed in order to be eligible for these programs. I'd recommend federal support with a high return on investment that addresses companies' new technical challenges around carbon reduction. That would really work. The investment that the company makes has to equal the risk, and you need to incentivize the risk that they'd be undertaking. Number two, universities can play a role if engaged to be that technical support arm. Researchers Bellos and Brodsky at George Mason are looking at sustainability in supply chains and making manufacturers more sustainable overall. And on the IT end of the spectrum, that's something that we've seen a lot of small and mediums are slower to embrace, but with a little bit of help, they can get there. And then third, the America Makes Institutes, the manufacturing institutes like LIFT in Detroit, provide technical support, and they help develop the talent that creates more sustainable products. And being able to engage with them with the appropriate amount of support would really make a difference for the small and mediums to transition.
Thanks, Paula. Mark, I wanted to pivot to you and call on your hat of being formerly at DOE. And how could the existing DOE infrastructure be expanded to support clean manufacturing? Are there programs that you would like to bring back or further fund to see this happen?
So one of the things when I was at the Department of Energy, we really worked on something called the Clean Energy Manufacturing Initiative, to focus on two things. One is, how do we manufacture the things we have more effectively? And then how do we wind up manufacturing clean energy related products more effectively in the United States, more competitively in the United States? The two ideas: how do we wind up making the everyday things we use more sustainably? And then how do we wind up getting into this clean energy product manufacturing areas? From that, we had a couple of programs we started, and I'm pleased to say that, especially with Congress's support the last 4 years, despite the fact that the administration's request for manufacturing support in DOE has declined 70% every year or 80% every year, Congress in its wisdom has actually wound up increasing the budget. So Article 1 of the Constitution, Congress appropriates the money, that we've actually had a net growth in the funding for programs around this over the past 3-4 years. And that's been a real bipartisan support on those areas. A couple of key things to point out as programs. I'd mentioned the high performance computing for manufacturing program. That's an area where manufacturers are working directly with the national laboratories on these manufacturing related programs. And I think that's something that we can keep moving forward on. The Manufacturing USA program that Paula just mentioned relative to America Makes, for instance, and the LIFT Institute. This is a network of 15 institutes around the country that are public-private partnerships. So it's putting federal dollars to incentivize the beginning of these institutes, and then having industrial partnerships that wind up continuing forward. They work between universities, national labs, and companies to wind up getting those technologies out of the laboratory and into the marketplace as a result. 6 of those 15 institutes were actually sponsored by the Department of Energy, focused on wide-ranging things from advanced composite materials for next generation of wind turbines and lightweight vehicles, to having advanced power electronics so we can have a smarter grid that winds up being more interconnected out there, to having issues like the Smart Manufacturing Center, which is based out at UCLA, but has locations around the country, that's looking at this idea of how do we wind up using, what the Germans would call Industry 4.0, what the Japanese call their Robot Revolution Initiative, and the US we call Smart Manufacturing, which is how to use real-time control to optimize the operation of these systems, sensor-based controls that wind up making it so that the manufacturing sector works more efficiently and more productively. All of those programs, I think we need to wind up sort of building, supporting, putting on horsepower even further. I think a last area where I personally would like to see even greater investment is saying, how do we wind up then taking those technologies that are coming out of universities, particularly on entrepreneurial programs, but also for the ones that go to large companies, and really connecting better with our technical colleges and community colleges, because it's not necessary just to wind up getting, a gee whiz new widget coming out of my research lab, but we also then need to have a workforce that's in a position to take advantage of that and be more competitive. And that's the part companies often really, they're not in the education business, they're in the widget business or whatever it is the product they're making. This is an area where I think there's a huge opportunity for federal support. There's a huge opportunity coming out of COVID right now where, if people are not necessarily working full time, let's amp up their computer skills. Let's amp up their capability to work with robotic systems. Let's making sure that people are at all levels in a position to wind up being more competitive as we wind up coming out of this time.
Thank you, Mark. And Ryan, I wanted to pivot to you and ask if you could quickly talk about the Buy Clean policies that Third Way supports and why they're important on the national level.
Yeah, sure. So, the federal government and state governments, they buy a lot of materials when we're building roads, bridges, buildings, other infrastructure products. And when we talk about the carbon footprint of infrastructure, what we're really talking about is the amount of emissions that are produced when you're building that infrastructure, maintaining and operating it. We're not counting in the carbon footprint what went into or what emissions were produced by actually manufacturing the commodities, the materials that you're building with. And it's a lot. There was a report by Clean, supported by Climate Works Foundation, that found 25% of global emissions actually go through this carbon loophole. We're not counting who is exporting higher CO2 content materials and who's importing them. They don't go into your national contribution or your national determined contributions to the Paris Agreement. They're not really measured. So what Buy Clean does is provide, a consistent form of measuring what actually, it's called embodied carbon, how much carbon was produced in manufacturing those commodities, but then providing incentive for projects that are bidding in for federally supported contracts to use those cleaner materials, or definitely to not use the dirtiest materials that are out there. California has already passed a Buy Clean law. They're implementing that. That was something that got spurred after a project in the Bay Area, a bridge, used Chinese steel that actually had a much higher embodied carbon level than local steel. So, had they had this policy in place, they could have had a win-win where both local manufacturers of steel and emissions for the state would have been reduced. It's something that's picking up steam in the States, and something that we also need at the federal level. It's mentioned in the Clean Future Act, which the House Energy and Commerce Committee has put forward. And it's also not necessarily as a requirement in the House Transportation Infrastructure Bill on surface transportation, but they start moving down that path by looking at R&D to help reduce the amount of embodied carbon and ways that it could be actually measured.
Thanks so much, Ryan. And Mark, to follow up on that point, how can government procurement policies drive reductions in the manufacturing sector? After all, the U.S. government is one of the biggest global customers, so they have immense purchasing power. And how can that be applied toward helping us achieve our emissions reductions goals?
Yeah, I don't think the US government is one of the biggest consumers of products in the world. I think it is the biggest consumer of products in the world. And yeah, I mean, how do you wind up doing that? How do you wind up doing it so you're efficiently managing taxpayer dollars so it doesn't cost you more to do that? And that's always the trade-off people have. This idea of how you account for the amount of energy that goes into manufacturing, the amount of carbon that goes into manufacturing is a really significant point. The other term during the time of COVID people have started hearing is supply chain. And what that means is basically, you know, if I'm making a car, what I am actually doing is at the peak of this collection of companies that are delivering the parts to making the car, I've made the design, we've scheduled it, so it all winds up coming together and it gets put together in my factory. The largest energy consuming part of making cars is putting the paint on it at that location. That is clearly not the largest energy consuming part of an automobile, though, when you account for the steel, the plastics, and all the other materials that wind up going into making a car. And that highlights the challenge you wind up having. It's a step further than that, and this is actually where the role of the public sector can be strong on this, is what are sort of the accounting rules for how you account for them? And so it's a very mundane process, but it's something called ISO 50001, which is the International Standards Organization, that gets to the point where you say, all the companies in Germany and all the companies in Japan and all the companies in China and all the companies in the United States, we're all using the same rules for accounting for the amount of carbon in it. How do we wind up developing those standards together? It works the same way. Imagine if every company wound up using its own ways of deciding how to do accounting on their own books. It'd be chaos out there. You have a similar sort of situation right now in terms of energy and the importance of energy, particularly as you translate a product through the supply chain, where it may not be the energy that's the person that's delivering that product to the US government or whoever the customer, it's understanding how that carbon propagates throughout the system. I think that's a really important role. And then coming back from that, how do you make it as painless as possible for companies as they want to adopt those standards to do things like the ISO 50001 Ready program, that's there to wind up providing training and skills. So then as companies wind up pivoting to doing that in their supply chains, they're most effectively able to do that. The Department of Energy does tremendous work in this area. And I'll say a shout out to that entire group that winds up doing that.
Thank you, Mark. And to close out our panel discussion, Paul, I wanted to turn to you and, just ask about some corporate efforts. So we've seen in the past decade or so a big corporate shift that prioritizes sustainability. For instance, 10 years ago, and I remember being an intern 10 years ago and having to assess this, not every Fortune 500 company had a CSR policy, including a lot of the big manufacturers. So what do you think has accounted for this shift in corporate values, manufacturing companies and practices included?
Yeah, there were some corporations that were kind of early to the game. I had worked with Walmart a bit when they were trying to get off the grid and zero waste and very forward thinking in that way. But I worked in the clean tech sector in the late 2000s, helping a lot of game-changing technologies get private sector funding and get off the ground, like renewables and battery tech and materials. But broad public support was still very nascent at that time. Compare that with today's public views, and I'm thinking about the students that I've had work in the Economic Growth Institute at U of M. And I'd say that the up and coming workforce today is very evolved in their thinking about the environment and the types of companies that they want to work for. The competition among companies to acquire skilled young talent who are very sustainability minded, I hope will be an incentive for companies to adopt more sustainable practices. It's being driven by the talent that they want to attract and that they want to keep.
Thanks so much. And just to close this out, I wanted to turn to each panelist just for a minute or less to give us a really quick closing thought, maybe a positive thought and a cool insight, something to send our audience off with. So why don't we go to Ryan, Mark, and then end with Paula.
Sure. For me, this actually has been, I'll start my positive with maybe a little bit of a negative. When I first started looking at industrial emissions or emissions from the industrial sector, it was really daunting, especially when seeing that while other sectors were projected to decrease in emissions or stay stagnant. The industrial sector was the only one that was projected to see significant growth in emissions when we actually need to be going the other way. I won't say that that's completely changed. Those projections have not been reversed. But I will say that there is so much more activity going on at the federal policy level on industrial sector emissions than even just 2 years ago. So we've seen it come through in appropriations. Mark mentioned some of them, but also very specific appropriations and carve-outs for things like CCUS for industrial facilities. Also, plenty of legislation that's been introduced in the past year and a half, including the Clean Industrial Technologies Act from Senator Whitehouse and Congressman Caston, that works on expanding RD&D activities within the Department of Energy. It's mentioned in, I talked about some of the work in the Surface Transportation Bill. It's really permeating the policy discussion, not just the climate discussion. It's getting into a lot of other vehicles that are really important for the development of the technologies and the products that are going to help manufacture more and manufacture cleaner in the US. So just having that attention from policymakers in a way that we didn't see 2 years ago is a huge improvement and provides me with some optimism.
Great, thank you so much. Mark?
Yeah, great. And Ryan, I'm so glad you wound up pointing out 45Q. I'd forgotten about that there's so much that's gone on that's hard to forget that is a huge change to wind up having carbon capture and utilization support for it out there. Mm-hmm. When I think about this and such a realization on manufacturing and the importance of manufacturing in the last few months, and there's also been some discussions of doom and gloom. Oh, this shows how manufacturing isn't good in the United States. And often there's that is an analogy back to World War II. People forget in World War II, Pearl Harbor happened in the beginning of early December. It took us until the middle of June before the Battle of Midway could happen afterwards. That was 6 months. That's the first time we could even start moving out on it. Here in manufacturing, we've gone in 3 months from concerns about things like how do we have enough respirators to have a massive number of companies step up. And the manufacturers pivoted right into this problem. I can't think of a manufacturer that I've talked to that has not thought through and said, what can we wind up doing to respond to this issue? So I actually think that in retrospect, we will look at this and say, this is it's the manufacturing sector's one of its more finest hours, a great example of what they've done on it. Now, are there things we can wind up doing better? Yes, I think on the federal level, how do we plan better? That's a huge issue we can have. But manufacturing has moved forward on this in a good way. I think it shows the strength, again, of being able to innovate. I noticed in the Q&A, I want to make sure I clarify this also. What I was talking about in terms of manufacturing peak in 1978, that was employment peak. Manufacturing output peak was in 2019. So the manufacturing sector in the United States has never been stronger than it is now. And I think, it's never afraid of innovating. So how do we wind up addressing these environmental issues? Let's wind up working together and make that wind up happening.
Thank you. And Paula?
So what to end on a positive note, because I think the upside of everything that's happening is that this is causing us to rethink a lot of things. And if we have to rethink and we have to reboot, let's think about how to do this appropriately. Let's learn the lessons from the past, figure out how to restart. What tools do we need? We know a lot more than we think we do about what resilience and recovery looks like. And we also know a lot about what a sustainable economy can look like. And to put all of those to work is, if not now, then when?
Great. Thank you so much. So now we'll have a couple moments for audience questions. So we have a couple that have come in already. And audience, if you have anything to ask of our panelists, make sure you type it into the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. So the first question we will ask comes from Ellen Hughes Cromwick, and Ellen asks, who was a former panelist, what about the Department of Energy loan program? Won't that help fund commercialization of new tech like electric vehicles and battery cell manufacturing? So maybe Ryan, we can go to you on that one.
Sure. Yeah. Short answer is yes. We need as many tools available to assist industry as possible. And in fact, there are things that could be improved about the loan program office. There could be more flexibility in the type of instruments that get used for financing. But I guess to my main point, yes, as many tools as possible to help move these projects forward. Unfortunately, we've seen that office politicized, and we've seen attempts from the White House to eliminate its budget and eliminate the program. But it's important to remember that has had a loan program office has actually had a really successful record in terms of its portfolio and return on investment. And also it did help spur industries that we didn't have at a commercial level here in the United States. It's hard to think that not too long ago, when we had before we had the LPO, we were not building commercial scale solar projects in the US. We did need some assistance for some of these riskier projects to get them kicked off. So turn into a long answer, but I would say absolutely yes, we need to preserve that program, and also we need to be looking at other opportunities for financing and incentivizing the domestic manufacturing of emerging and really potentially profitable technologies and industries.
Great, thank you, Ryan. And Todd Allen asks Paula, as we shift towards zero carbon energy sources, how does the transition affect small and medium-sized manufacturers?
The same way that any significant market transition affects them is that the expectation that it's going to require investment. It might not be investment that they have. It's going to require technical support, and it might not be technical support that they already have. There's going to be something that will be needed to be put in play. And by something, I mean highly effective programs to move in a positive direction and connect them to those resources. And often those resources are already around, they just don't know how to access them. A typical small or medium-sized business does not know how to go to Clemson or to go to the University of Michigan and say, hey, I want to use your lab. They don't know how to get in that door. And so support like that helps make that introduction is really critical.
Great, thanks, Jackie. And then, sorry, Jackie Toth is asking a question. I'm reading and speaking when I'm reading. Mark, could you go into a little further detail about the interconnection between IT and manufacturing and the connections and growth opportunities that exist there?
Yeah, so it's interesting. You walk through a modern factory today, and you look around and you say, these are clean jobs that are very highly skilled jobs, because it's things like automated systems and autonomous systems working in partnership with the workers on the floor doing that work. And even down at a small manufacturer, it is things like advanced CNC design systems that give you quick turnaround from the design cycle to the production cycle. That is only enabled by having really well interconnected information technology systems. And the companies that wind up investing in that area, I mean, you want to invest as you need to grow with your customers, but companies that invest in information technology tend to wind up getting more productive. That makes them more profitable. It allows them to grow. And as Paula just pointed out, how does a change affect a small business? Well, they need to change as well, and then that's an opportunity for a new market. That's a good thing to have out there. The other thing to point out is, even in large companies then, let's say the good people at some automotive OEM or aerospace OEM have a person in-house that does something like supply chain logistics, which sounds like a fairly boring topic, but it's a really important topic in manufacturing. If they're not able to find that high quality scientist or computer scientist that does that work in their own firm, they'll turn around to a range of information technology companies and outsource to them. That job then is at, you name the company out there, SAP, SAS, you name it, is actually a manufacturing job that gets accounted for as being an information technology job. But it would not exist if you did not have manufacturing at the core of it. So these are two really closely linked issues, because how you account what sector the job's in is really tightly tied to what the end product of the company is, and less so accounted in terms of what the job function you do there is. And so as you wind up having greater and greater information intensity in manufacturing, you wind up having more and more information technology coming through. I'll say that at the university level, if I talk to manufacturers here, they say, Yeah, we need more mechanical engineers, industrial engineers, and chemical engineers, but what we really need them to know how to do is do computer science as well. And so that's even changing the educational requirements you wind up having for people that wind up moving into more leadership positions in companies. That trickles throughout the entire workforce. It's a really important area. It's home turf advantage for the United States. This is what we're really, really good at. And so instead of saying, hey, we need to retreat from the idea of technology, innovation, and changing, we wind up saying, how do we embrace this? How do we move forward? How do we wind up being the most competitive place in the world in our end products that reflects that we have the strongest university and national lab system in the world?
Great. And I think we have time for just about one or two more questions. And this next one comes from one of our Daily Planet readers, James Petrilla. And he asks, the administration has used the COVID crisis to say that the EPA's enforcement program is on hold for an indeterminate period of time. In terms of clean manufacturing, is this a short-term issue or a long-term issue? How concerned should we be about this? And I don't know if there's a panelist that wants to take this one. Maybe Ryan?
Sure. I mean, I think we should be concerned for a lot of reasons. You know, if you're supportive of manufacturing or if you're an entrepreneur, absolutely. If you are somebody that breathes air and drinks water in this country, absolutely. So, you know, I would say that this is one of several regulations or proposed regulations that could be very damaging, but that there are a number of ways to avoid and pitfalls where this could actually get derailed. So I think it's important to stay vigilant about these types of regulatory attempts. But I wouldn't say that this is one of the most urgent issues specifically in, you know, for manufacturers of clean products. But it is something that definitely requires attention and hopefully will not actually succeed.
Thank you so much. And we have a question, and this one is for Mark, and I think this will be probably the last one we have time for. But Mark, should DOE be reorganized to draw better attention and optimize its clean manufacturing activities?
Wow, should the Department of Energy be reorganized? Well, of course you want to wind up getting greater efficiency out of every organization you have. You know, do I have areas where I think that manufacturing can have greater effect out there? First of all, if you look at the authorizations on which they work, they're really built around energy efficiency authorizations and technology innovation. I think you can wind up clearly utilizing some of the authorization around the impact on the environment, the way ARPA-E's authorization is, to wind up saying, how do you expand the scope of some of the work that it winds up working in? And so I think that that's an area you can look at. It's been since, what, 2005, the last time that the Department of Energy was actually reauthorized. It's been a while. You know, it's probably worthwhile looking at those areas and saying, how do you wind up doing that? How do you wind up elevating the importance of it? Well, manufacturing, as I said, is not only important for improving the efficiency of the products that you make, but then as you develop things like information technology systems, 3D printing, new composites, that has impact in everything from manufacturing of the power systems that we use for providing electricity, to the grid that we wind up having, to the cars we wind up using as electric vehicles. So manufacturing has this cross-cutting impact across the Department of Energy. And that's certainly an area you wind up making sure you reinforce in whatever way you're organized. I think that they do a good job on that. As I said, over the last, 3 or 4 years, I mean, the current administration, we've actually had a growth in investment driven mainly by Congress in manufacturing issues. How do we get greater visibility out of that? How do we wind up making it, as Paula pointed out, so our national labs and our universities we're investing in are easier for manufacturers to work with? How do we, it's the mundane bureaucracy paperwork of doing CRADAs that would be great to wind up improving. But, it's those sort of things I think can have huge impact to wind up unleashing the power of what we wind up having.
Great. Well, I just want to thank all of our panelists for joining us and giving their time for this great discussion. And thank you for everyone who tuned in today. And we will have one more of these panels left. We have yet, I think, to determine a date, but please sign up for Our Daily Planet at ourdailyplanet.com, and we will certainly share information there. Follow Third Way on Twitter or Our Daily Planet on Twitter, University of Michigan, and we will give that information when we schedule our last panel. So thank you everyone for tuning in, and hope you have a good rest of your day. Bye-bye.
Thank you.